Right, I'd like to talk about inequality, and I'd like to talk about what can be done to deal with the problems of inequality that we have in our society. Now, as won't have escaped anyone's attention, this is a deeply unequal society that we now live in. Many young people find it very difficult to get to become property owners, to get on the housing market. It's very different in terms of opportunities to become property owners to how things were in Britain 40 or 50 years ago. Here are some very nondescript flats in London. They've got a nice view, but nothing particularly special. And yet anything like that would be well out of the reach of most regular couples who even had fairly nice jobs, unless they had a lot of help from the bank of mum and dad. A recent report showed that last year in London, where these problems are especially bad, there were twice as many two-bedroom flats sold in a band that goes from £700,000 to £1 million as there were two-bedroom flats sold in the band that straddles the £350,000 mark. So even with the government's new scheme to help first-time buyers to buy affordable properties, where affordable now in 2016 in London by the government's definition means up to £400,000, there aren't actually the properties for people to buy at that price level. So something's happened whereby we've become a very unequal society, and it's very difficult for people to get the kind of start in life that once they could. Things used to be rather different in Britain, as some of you may remember. 50 years ago, it was much easier for people starting out to become property owners. And 50 years ago, two things happened. More than two things happened, but two particular things. The Beatles went to America. Here they are, arriving at JFK. And James Meade, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote his classic, but unfortunately neglected book, Efficiency, Equality, and the Ownership of Property. So Meade is a very interesting figure. He lived from 1907 to 1995, a leading British economist of the 20th century, won the Nobel Prize for his technical work in the theory of international trade, but his interest, for my purposes, is a book he wrote about what he thought would be future trends in inequality and how one could deal with them. And he was basically wizard-like in his predictive powers. In 1964, at a time where the share of, by his measure, the share of national income that went to labour was 85%, at a time where this was a relatively egalitarian society, Meade was worried about what the long-term developments of economic processes that he thought had already begun would turn out to be. And he thought that processes of technological innovation, of increasingly capital-intensive production, would mean that in the long run there would be deep problems of inequality. And so Meade wrote, even at that time, he said, looking forward, we're going to reach a point where, as returns to capital increase, as the share of national income going to capital increases, we're going to end up at what he called the brave new capitalist paradise. So he sat in his armchair in Cambridge in 1964, and he's imagining the future. And this is what he thought the future would look like. There would be a limited number of exceedingly wealthy property owners. The proportion of the working population required to man the extremely profitable automated industries would be small. Wage rates would thus be depressed. There would have to be a large expansion of the production of the labour-intensive goods and services which were in demand by the few multi-millionaires. We would be back in a super world of an immiserised proletariat and of butlers, footmen, kitchen maids, and other hangers-on. That's fairly accurate, right? It may not be fully as bad as Meade thought, but there's much more employment opportunities for you if you're a butler now in 2015 than there was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Meade was definitely onto something. And the proportion of national income that goes to labour as opposed to returns to capital is now under 50%. right? In Q3 of 2015, the Office of National Statistics had that figure at 49%. So returns to capital are high, returns to labour are low. Inequality of wealth is accelerating in the way that Meade thought it would do. Now, is that something to be worried about? I think it wouldn't be much to worry about, or we wouldn't be as worried if the rich, if those with a lot of wealth, if those that benefited from these economic processes just spent their money on Damien Hirst sharks or yachts or old wine or fripperies like Chelsea Football Club. But unfortunately, that's not what all of the wealthy do. So here's Donald Trump, someone who benefited from a large inheritance from his own father, and he spends his money, or at least part of it, on trying to convert his wealth into political power. And another thing Trump does is transmit economic advantage to the Trump dynasty. So if you look at Trump's various companies, 3 of them are run by his children. And these 2 things that the very wealthy do, 1, try to buy political power, and 2, try to buy dynastic economic opportunities for their families to the exclusion of others. I think those are deep worries that aren't to do with some objection to inequality per se, but they're to do with objections to what large inequalities of wealth do in terms of either political fairness or economic fairness. Here's an example closer to home. Mr. Murdoch is about 3 times as wealthy as Mr. Trump, but one might think, with his 3 children running 3 subsidiary companies, that he's someone just as interested in dynastic succession of economic advantage. And for anyone who might have read about Mr. Murdoch's Christmas party, at which half of the cabinet attended, including the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, and the Culture Secretary, who's in charge of regulating newspapers and television, you might come to the view that Mr. Murdoch is as interested as Mr. Trump is in converting large agglomerations of wealth into agglomerations of political power. So my modest claim is that we need to think very hard about how to deal with large inequalities of wealth, both if we're interested on one side of this issue about the chances that regular people might have in order to become property owners, to kind of get on the ladder of property ownership, and if we're worried at the very top end of this effect about the sorts of special advantages that the very wealthy have. So James Meade had 4 suggestions, 4 strategies for what you could do. He thought you could have what he called a trade union state. He thought you could try and arrest this process that brought higher returns to capital rather than to labour, and try to raise wages as much as you could do. But Meade thought you shouldn't do that. He thought, actually, we should welcome processes of technological information that allow more capital-intensive production. It would be Luddite to try to kind of roll back to a state where we didn't have that. And it would be economically inefficient to make employment more expensive than it should be. Instead, what we needed to do was find a way of having more of a separation between wage rates and people's total income. We needed to find ways in which regular people could get some benefit from capital returns as well as just from returns to labour. He also thought about what one might do to extend the welfare state. What could you do to tax more and then have more transfers or more public spending? And Meade thought that while those sorts of functions of government are very important, they can't get you that far. If the very deep mechanisms of economic inequality are about the distribution of wealth, then the small things that you can do in terms of either taxation of current income or current spending are just not fundamental enough to undertake any kind of deeper reorientation of those processes of inequality. So you don't just go in for redistribution, Meade thought. You have to worry about predistribution. You have to worry about the underlying allocation of ownership and control over property and resources. So he had 2 strategies that fall under that predistributive heading. what he called a property-owning democracy, which was about the broad dispersal of private holdings of wealth, and what he called a socialist state, which was finding a way to have public or state-run or collective forms of ownership over capital and wealth that could bring collective returns. And he didn't think that these were exclusive options. He thought that what a society, what a government, what a state that was interested in fighting against some of these forces of inequality ought to do is it should pursue a mixture of property-owning democracy and these sorts of more socialist or collective mechanisms. Now, I think there's one British politician who took very seriously the lesson of at least half of Meade's thinking. Well, at most half of Meade's thinking, which is this British politician, well known to many of you. Mrs. Thatcher's policy of selling off council housing was exactly the kind of thing that Meade had in mind when he talked about a property-owning democracy. When he talked about finding mechanisms whereby the government could sort of subsidise or kind of create conditions whereby individuals who might not have been able to become meaningful property owners got the chance to become property owners. Unfortunately, I think Mrs. Thatcher didn't do it in exactly the way Meade might have done it. What Meade was interested in was ongoing mechanisms that would have allowed the broad dispersal of property generation after generation. Whereas obviously what we had with Mrs. Thatcher was a one-shot operation that benefited one generation, often to the detriment of those who came afterwards. There wasn't sort of reinvestment of those receipts, and actually the majority of properties sold under that scheme are now owned by private landlords rather than by individual homeowners. And it won't surprise you that Mrs. Thatcher didn't so much pursue the second collectivist or socialist strand in what Meade thought was necessarily a two-pronged strategy for a more egalitarian society. In fact, she was doing the opposite at the same time. The returns from council housing were being used to fund tax cuts and to fund current expenditure. We see the same with North Sea oil. Right, so the returns that Britain had from North Sea oil were folded into current expenditure, allowed the Lawson tax cuts of the mid-80s. There wasn't a sort of structural view taken about what could be done in terms of the long-run benefits of the wealth that created. If we look across the North Sea to our neighbours in Norway, they'd read the other half of Meade to the half that Mrs. Thatcher might have been influenced by. And the Norwegians, what they did with some of their receipts from North Sea oil was invest it in exactly the kind of public assets, the kind of sovereign wealth fund that Meade thought a country that was interested in socialising and collectivising returns to capital ought to invest in. And the Norwegians have managed to create, through their Statens Pensjonsfond Utland, and apologies to any Norwegians if my pronunciation isn't quite right, a sovereign wealth fund that holds $857 billion, or 1% of global equities. If you take all the shares in all the companies in the world, Norway own 1%. The Norwegian citizen, every man, woman and child in Norway, has a claim on the returns from 1% of global equities. So a strategy that tried to think about collective forms of investment in wealth is not just a kind of theoretical proposal that someone like Meade might have had, but it's something that actually a neighbouring country that in some ways faced some similar decisions in the last generation and made very different decisions to the ones that we made, have actually been able to realise. So having had a picture of one ideologically committed politician, here's a picture of another British politician of similarly firm ideological commitments, who I won't say much about, other than to say that what's perhaps most interesting about, I think, the as yet undeveloped economic thinking of the current Labour Party is at least they're speaking to some people who are who have thought about these deep problems about inequalities of wealth rather than inequalities of income, and people like Thomas Piketty, who I think of in some ways as a kind of intellectual grandson of James Meade, and whose proposals about how one copes with wealth inequalities actually make some proposals that are as radical as the kinds of things that Mrs. Thatcher did in the 80s, albeit with a different kind of goal and with a more egalitarian orientation. So my very modest aim with this talk really is to say kind of two things. One, that this 50-year-old classic book that opens up the space for thinking about wealth inequality and how we deal with it is one that more people should be reading. And two, sort of following from that, we need to think about a much broader set of possible policies about how we deal with the very deep problem of wealth inequality. And if we don't deal with it, we see a future where increasingly our children aren't going to be able to become property owners in a meaningful way, and our politics is very likely to be dominated by the whims of eccentric plutocrats. And I don't think any of us really want that. So thank you very much.